There appeared to be a natural hush descended, so I thought I would take my opportunity. Gosh, this is a big room. Consul General, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Louise MacDonald, and as a trustee of the RSA and also chair of the RSA in Scotland, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to Edinburgh this evening for the annual Angus Millar Lecture. My duties are brief. It is to remind you of housekeeping. So first of all, could I ask everyone to please completely switch off any telephones and mobile devices? And I'll allow the rustle to run round the room as everybody kind of does that. I'd appreciate it if you would actually switch them off, because otherwise they do interfere with the equipment, and we are recording this evening's proceedings. So I appreciate that. Secondly, fire exits are all very, very clearly marked. There is no test scheduled, so if you hear the fire alarm, it's a real one. So if everyone can please leave by the exit signed, and the muster point is the north side of Queen Street by the gardens. Finally, first aid. We are delighted that we do have first aid with us this evening. So if you are in need or require any help at all, if you can please just indicate by standing up, and someone will be with you very, very shortly. Now, before I leave you, I have one further courtesy to ask of you. I have been asked this evening to kindly remind you that this event is a global event. It is not about Edinburgh. This event is about looking at practice worldwide to provide a basis for discussion. It's particularly important that the RSA does not encroach on the Province of Edinburgh Civic Trust, which on Thursday welcomes Professor Herb Stovall to speak in Edinburgh. So bearing that in mind, I would be grateful if you could perhaps hold that debate until Thursday, if you're willing, and to direct your questions to our speakers later on in a more global perspective. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to our chair for the evening, Dr. Lester Borley. Many of you will know him as a council member and past Secretary General of Europa Nostra, but also one-time Director of the National Trust for Scotland. Dr. Borley, I kindly invite you to briefly introduce our speakers, as their biographies are in the programme, and of course we want to maximise time for discussion and to call on them to make their presentations. I wish you all a highly enjoyable evening. Dr. Borley.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for me this evening to be asked to chair this meeting of the Royal Society of Arts. The role of a chairman is very difficult. It's rather like the role of cavalry in the time of war, to lend tone to what might otherwise be an ugly brawl. So in many ways, I think I have a double duty tonight, because there's such a demand for the lecture that we've also got some people in another room listening to this lecture on a video link. So I have to have eyes in the back of my head on this occasion as well as in the front. The task tonight is to cover the subject of new designs in historic settings. And I can remember going for the first time to Verona in Italy and being absolutely delighted and overwhelmed when I went into the Piazza del Signori to see a remarkable vestige of the 12th century through to the Renaissance, of buildings of different centuries sitting in perfect harmony in that remarkable square. And I've always remembered it as an object lesson on how a city can plan everything to be, if you like, humble in the presence of its seniors or its predecessors. And I suppose that's the task for all cities which claim to have an historic setting. How do new designs fit? And tonight we have two excellent speakers with considerable international reputations. You have the biographies, and I hope that you will find that their contributions tonight will enlarge our own vision of this topic. But we would not be here tonight if it weren't for the generosity of the Millar family, because this lecture every year is given in the name of Angus Millar. And the first of these lectures was held 10 years ago, so time has really gone by. Those of us who knew Gus Millar knew that he was a very fine lawyer and businessman, but we also knew him as a person who supported what we call the third sector, the non-government sector, in all the ways he could. And I suppose, in a sense, what tonight we shall be trying to do in honor of his memory is to come to some broad conclusions of the balance between the role of government, the business community, and civil society. Both our speakers have been told they've got a limit to the time they can speak, and I won't be rude to them because one should not be rude to one's guests from overseas. But we have 2 papers each which will be 25 minutes in length, and then we will come to a question and answer session. And you have to bear in mind that we do have people in the seminar room, and you'll have to bear with me as I field the questions from both audiences. One I can see and one I can't. So it's going to be a real test of my ability. First of all, therefore, I want this evening to ask Cezary Bednarski, who is very actively involved in the Royal Society of Arts, who holds dual nationality, is not only a Pole by birth, but he's now British as well. So we congratulate you on that double honour. But we ask Cezary if he would now make the first presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. Heritage. As you can see from the little quotation there, there is something to be said about protecting it. New design in heritage settings. We can't avoid the Vienna Memorandum on World Heritage and Contemporary Architecture, which was signed in 2005. And I'd like you to read 3 slides. These are the only text slides. And I'll leave it to you to read those. So these 3 concepts should, in fact, underline all work in historic context. Here we've got the German salaried Luftwaffe working in the historic context of Warsaw. This is the result. You can see the old town square. They've done even better at the Warsaw Ghetto, and even better in Rotterdam. What does one do with it? Do we do what has been done in Rotterdam, build a new city from scratch? Or do you do what has been done in Warsaw? You reconstruct painfully, painstakingly, your national heritage. What Germans didn't destroy, the Poles are doing themselves. On the left, you've got the National Opera House in Warsaw. On the right, building by Lord Foster, which would be well placed in Houston, Texas, Kamchatka, Yokohama, or some other place like this. But there are much more subtle ways of dealing with historic context. This is Krakow, one of the most beautiful medieval cities of Europe, unique square. The Russians didn't like us very much, and they had a very clever ploy of locating a big steel mill, where the little yellow spot is here, upwind from Krakow. The idea was quite sophisticated, that the acid rain and everything else within 50, 60, 70 years would destroy Krakow. Luckily, it didn't happen. This is the Lenin steel mill in Krakow. What the Russians didn't do, Poles are doing themselves. This is the royal castle, arguably the most important castle in Poland. To the left of it, you have this new hotel, built by Polish architects without a competition even. However, I design bridges. So I'd like to bring bridges into the subject. on the same theme, which is destruction, reconstruction. Do we reconstruct? Do we build new? Do we build a high-tech bridge in Mostar, or we reconstruct the old one? I think what has been done is probably quite useful to protect the identity and the heritage of the setting. This is for real. This slide opened a presentation by the governor of Luxor to my colleague and myself in May last year when we traveled there as consultants to UNESCO to review projects in Luxor and in Cairo. The governor, Dr. Samir Farag, an ex-general, ex-director of the Opera House in Cairo, is now the governor, and a very effective governor. And he set out to empty the heart of the city. Karnak Temple, Luxor Temple, the Avenue of the Sphinxes, as it was. At the moment, there is a citadel covering some 20,000 square meters of space. But the archaeological determinism seems to take the primary position in Luxor at the moment, and the green line, 70 meters either side of it, will be wiped out in order to create this. Now, this city has history, 200-300 years history. If it was New Zealand or the United States of America, nobody would conceivably think about demolishing these buildings. But if you're dealing with history which is several thousand years old, maybe that's the right way of doing it. It will look like this. Men in black suits. Karnak Temple, an unusual jumble of archaeological treasures. That's the proportions. So we're talking about this area here, of which, as you can see on the small part, is really kind of with artifacts. The whole forefront of the temple is being dealt with by the governor. That's what it was, with the French archaeological housing over here, rather spectacular modernist houses right on the Nile. A bit of a mess, but a bit of trees, a bit of shade, a bit of mixed environment. These are the houses which are now gone, despite protests. This is the proposal. I think Mussolini would be very proud of it. Imagine that we are talking about an environment where you have 45 degrees temperature, sun above your head all the time, and we are putting a few palms here and there and creating a frying pan for the tourists. They'll be hot from the underside and from the top, reaching right to the Nile. And that's what's being built at the moment. This is the visitors center. It is not public toilets by a highway, it's a visitors center for the Temple of Karnak. This is the governor. Not very pleased, because we were standing there in half-built visitors center with a glass roof more or less the size of this space here. And I asked him, what is the logic of it? We've got the sun, which is virtually horizontal, is guaranteed day after day after day. The building has got 4 front facades. There is no back facade to it. It would have to be air-conditioned to an amazing scale. So the governor was not very pleased, as you can see, by the body language. And that's what has been built. There's the new visitor center to one of the World Heritage Monuments, with cladding like a suburban bungalow. That's where the French archaeologists are being rehoused to. But let's move on to the Luxor Temple. What it was fairly green piazza with lots of shade, where the traders would mingle with the tourists. What it is another frying pan, not a drop of shadow. The soles of your shoes melt from the stone, which heats up day after day. Let's move to Goodneugh. Goodneugh, as you know, is a village which was set up on the remains of a great number of lesser tombs, one has to say, where the tomb thieves were stealing from and selling to British Museum and other organizations. Several hundred years old. Some of the buildings there were 200 years old. There were several attempts to empty it and remove the people who made a living of stealing to other locations. One of them was, in fact, by Hassan Fatih in the 40s. Now, our governor, being a general, knew how to get on with it, so he got on with it. Goodneugh is gone. There was no survey, no architectural survey, no ethnographical survey, no records. They've been rehoused here. It looks picturesque just because of the way this light came out. It is not. On the other hand, Hassan Fatih, probably the most important Egyptian architect of the 20th century, built a new Goodneugh, where the people were supposed to rehouse. That's his house in New Goodneugh, and that's the state of it. Still looks up. The red arrow points to the Valley of the Kings, arguably one of the most important sites of humanity. I would like to point your attention to this object here, which is the new visitor center. Through a deal with the Japanese government financed the construction of the new visitor center to one of the most important monuments of humanity. That's the quality of objects and artifacts. Here we have the president, the minister of culture, a gentleman from the Council of Antiquities opening the object. Without a doubt, there's a spectacular model there, which has been formed in clear plastic. When you look underneath, you've got all the chambers and tunnels indicated, which is highly educational. However, it is housed in this. Is this the visitor center for one of the most important monuments of humanity, donated by the Japanese government? That's the front of it. That's the way tourists try to hide from sun in a sliver of shadow. That's the hopeless interior, which is completely dysfunctional and inadequate. All the traders have been kicked out, and what has been built is a series of public toilets which can open and allow new traders to step in and display their goods on half a meter of a stepped stone. But not the end of it. Now, the left-hand side is where all the antiquities are, and the important part of Luxor. Luxor town is on the right-hand side. UNESCO has been advocating for many years that no development should take on the West. However, the governor has a new idea, which is a marina. The marina would have hotels looking like the pharaoh's death boats. I'll leave it at that. Now let's move to Cairo. The main reason for our visit was in fact a calamity which is ongoing in Cairo, where the biggest and the most powerful Egyptian developer decided to build Cairo Financial Center within the remains of a quarry from which stone was quarried for the Giza pyramids, and in the direct proximity of the Muhammad Ali Citadel and the mosque. That's the quarry. To locate you, the Citadel is over here. The site is over here. There's the mosque. There's the Citadel, like another monument of human thought and art. The developer very proudly employed Raphael Vignoli, who produced this. I'll leave it without comment. After intervention by UNESCO, he switched his designers, and an unknown office from Midwest United States of America produced something which nobody had seen, but so much of it has been built. Suddenly the horror hit the buffers. The Council of Antiquities, Zahi Hawass, requested UNESCO to visit and express a view on this. I was there as an architect, my colleague was an archaeologist, and we had to express a view. Now, you would expect in this kind of context, the architect, as a matter of course, start from making a very accurate model of the whole context. So we asked to see the model, and there was none. We then said, well, you obviously have drawn some plans, sections, elevations, contextual drawings, which would indicate, how you're proposing to do it versus the Citadel. There was none. So we have asked for the works to be stopped. This was the masterpiece. Then the developer, in fact, agreed to change the design and produce this stage masterpiece, which is now being built. I understand that Professor Pini and Francesco Bandarina are going to Egypt in a matter of few days, exposing themselves to a personal risk, I understand as well. This is the quality of drawings we received this being apparently the Citadel wall. You know, some of the later drawings, they were showing the building with the level indicated 51 meters and a half, being lower than 41-meter wall of the Citadel. So, I mean, an astonishing game, basically. However, not all is bad when you work for UNESCO. One of the perks is being treated very well by the locals, and we had an amazing opportunity of visiting the tomb of Nefertari, which is closed to the public and allowed to roam around it with cameras. So I took these pictures. Now, the question is then, who should design in the historic context? Obviously, the Japanese example is frightening, and we have no idea who designed it even. There's no name to the architect. Maybe big-name architects, or maybe the clever architects. This is the Royal College of Physicians in London, by Dennis Lasdon, set in a very historic Georgian context. In my perception, one of the best buildings built in the UK is the wartime. But the genius is, in fact, the conference hall, which is quite a large object, but is so inset there that if you ask anybody who drives by the building, goes to Regent's Park, whether they've noticed it, they would say they haven't, because it's really barely noticeable. And the reason is such that it is an abstract object which is treated as a part of the landscape. It is not really a building which would compete with the existing context. So, what about another brilliant architect? I just would like to quote here a little line from the June 2001 Architectural Review, where Mr. Manasek said, "It is astonishing that Daniel Libeskind can write so much nonsense without endangering his reputation." And we move on. Frank Gehry, without a doubt, a master of the confused and convoluted, in a very graceful way, very impressive. Now, would we, for example, want Frank Gehry to do the visitor center in Pompeii? Maybe we would. What about this? Or that? We, in fact, worked with Kibera, the slum in Nairobi, and we thought that the World Center for Research into Unplanned Communities could, in fact, be Frank Gehry's work. Let metal go to metal. Rusty, non-rusty. What about bridges? Calatrava in Seville. You've seen it in books if you're interested in bridges. In my perception, it's the most idiotic bridge of the 20th century because it uses sheer mass to hold up a load, which is not particularly intelligent. You know, the lever and things were discovered by the Greeks. But what contribution it makes to the panorama of Seville, the south arm of Calatrava. Dresden had a competition for a new bridge, and it would appear that it backfired. A bridge which is rather mediocre as a design itself won the competition, which is being shown on this picture. There were some other options. UNESCO stepped in and they said, this is not on, you can't really build this kind of bridge in this context. So Professor Schleich, quite an old, elderly, rather nice German engineer, came up with an option, which is this bridge here, which I think would probably work rather well. And it's a very delicate bridge. But for some reasons, the mayor of Dresden has not presented this to UNESCO. So the battle goes on. Venezia, Calatrava. An arch, just finished. My problem with this bridge is such that because of the nature of Venezia, you do lots of traveling on water, so the underside of the bridge is rather critical. What you see here is a very aggressive engineering in a nutshell. Beautiful form, but heavy engineering. Now, I have another problem with this bridge, and if there's a patent lawyer among you, you might comment on this. In 1993, before Calatrava sketched up his bridge, I won a competition for a bridge over the Thames, which looked like this. Can I sue for copyright on the form? Now, historic context is not necessarily urban. What you see here, unbelievably, is a new World Heritage Site on the Tamar, near a village called GANS Lake, where there were world-famous tin mines. within the last 2 years declared by UNESCO as World Heritage Site. That's all you see. We were commissioned to do a design for a bridge which would enable the tourists to come across the river from the little town of GANS Lake to the archaeological site, which is on the other side. Very many levels, changing levels, and we thought, how do you relay what was happening there and which is no longer visible to our times? And we thought that, most probably what was happening there was very rudimentary on one hand, because mining was fairly straightforward, but also ingenious, with lots of courage. So we proposed a bridge, which is rather unusual, which would look like this. Romans worked, in my definition, in the times of compression. All the arches rely on heavy forces, gravity, holding things down, and as a result, they were able to build. We, I think, work in times of tension, not only structurally, but otherwise as well. Another bridge, which I'd like to show you, on the line of the Hadrian's Wall in Carlisle. The wall was virtually on the line of the bridge. A competition we won some years ago, which was killed by the Tory party coming into the council and cancelling all Millennium projects by the Labour. Again, the attempt was to try to somehow express our times, that we do work in times of tension. So this is an unusual, very unusual stress ribbon bridge, which is catenary, a very thin concrete shell which hangs. It was hailed around the world as an important thing, but then our Tory boys came in and the bridge is gone. Another little bridge where, again, one was trying to find a way how you would work with the context. Albert Dock in Liverpool. The developer, or rather owner, Arrowcroft, had a problem with letting this part of space here because it's very windy and nobody was getting there. So they thought, let's put a bridge here. But because it is a nasty environment, you do a nice glass tube. And we said, well, maybe not glass tube. Let's try to see what else we can do. And what we suggested was a couple of toroids overlapping from which the bridge would be suspended. And again, the idea here was that it is not visually aligned with the dock, which wouldn't make sense in our times because this was times of compression, we work in times of tension. However, it is an object which would somehow relay the excitement which came into the dock with the seamen coming from foreign places, with their stories, with the artifacts. And it is an object which probably would have related very well to the Tate Gallery in the opposite corner. Changing scale again, in the UK context, this tiny plot of land here is in Notting Hill Gate in a conservation area. We have a client who owns this building, and he's got a big garden, and he would like to extend the house. The context is like so. Across the street is this building here, with this nasty box, well painted white, looks original, is it not? On the other corner, we got this thing here. Across the street from us, we got this thing here. And then a couple of blocks down, we've got this. So we thought, well, let's put kind of, again, not matching, because this would have made sense, but a sculptural object, much on Lasdon's lines, into the garden. Lots of intense studies, visual studies and so on. So that's as it is, as it could be. We are reinstating the detail of the fence, and a very delicate, rounded object, sculptural, would sit there like so. After 7 months of bickering with the design officer, we are now asking them to refuse it, and we will win this permission on appeal. Is this the right way of spending public money? But not all is bad in London. This plot of land is at the corner of Westbourne Park Road and Basing Street. Basing Street Studios is just here. Madonna comes frequently on records still. Portobello Road is over here. And there was a house there before which was knocked down by the council. Then they turned it into a playground. The playground became drug addicts' den, so the council sold it. Now, we don't do historic buildings, but how do you address it? Now, if you look at all the houses, Victorian houses in the streets, they, foreshortened views give you a certain rhythm on all occasions. Then you know that Portobello is from Portobello in Panama, where first Henry Morgan in 1668 planted it, then Admiral Vernon in 1739, and there is certain aesthetics which goes with the Caribbean and the Panamanian architecture. So we thought maybe we do something like this. Now, The planning permission was granted within 6 weeks, 2 weeks ahead of the 8 weeks period. There were 3 letters of support, and since then the project developed quite dramatically. Now, as there's a huge Italian contingent here, I was a Rome scholar in Rome in 1996, and one of my subjects was bridges of Rome, Florence, and Venice. And going on boats on those rivers, I was pondering over ideas. Now, one of the strange ideas I came up to was the fact that you could, in fact, link San Pietro with the Mosque of Rome through a fairly straightforward axis. You go a series of streets up north, you cross the river at the right angle, you come to the 19th century symmetrical layout with Piazza Gentile da Fabriano. You extend this, you hit the Mosque of Rome. So hence the idea of an inhabited garden bridge between Christianity and Islam, which would be here. You would cross the river along a garden, and there's lots of green on both sides. There'll be buildings which will hide the structure. This is the diagram. In fact, the Royal Academy commissioned the model of this idea for the Living Bridges exhibition in 1996. It never went any further, but it obviously was inspired by Ponte Vecchio, Ponte Rialto, and bridges in Paris. And indeed by Michelangelo's idea of linking Palazzo Farnese with Villa Farnesina across the street, across the river with a garden bridge, of which only one arch remains over Via Giulia. So 3 quotes to close the talk. Cedric Price, which would be controversial with some of my audience here, however, it's worth reading it. Eric Drexler, who is a guru in the field of nanotechnology of all subjects. I recommend reading this book. There's lots of very intelligent thought there. And finally, my hero, Peter Brook, who I think touches on the most important aspect of our reality, which is the difference between how and how we can do lots of things in our times. I mean, virtually anything can be built, but the question is why. So we want to avoid this. And the subject obviously is very painful and multifaceted and involves lots of acupuncture, and Professor Pini would tell you about urban acupuncture. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that stimulating beginning. Obviously stressing the importance, as always, of historic context, the scale and the identity, and above all else, common sense, it seemed to me, in decision-making. So perhaps we've set the right tone. Now to have the second paper, before we go to the opportunity to question speakers, we would like to do it when they've both finished their papers. I'd like now to ask Professor Daniele Pini from Ferrara, again, a person you can see from the biography of tremendous international experience, that he can give us his view on new design in heritage settings. Thank you.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this capriccio of Canaletto clearly refers to Venice. It is a very strange image of Venice to refer to the question of identity, and because it shows the Rialto Bridge area as designed by Andrea Palladio, with the 2 buildings of Palladio which really exist, which have been built, Palazzo Chiericati in Vicenza and Basilica Palladiana also in Vicenza. The bridge of Rialto by Palladio could have been built, but it hasn't been built. Why? This is my introduction to the topic of new design in heritage setting. As you can see, the issue of new design in heritage settings is a very old one. The painting of Canaletto dates the second half of the 18th century, and these projects of Palladio are dating of 1550, more or less. The bridge of Palladio has not been built because it was not Venetian. if I may say. Because it didn't have anything to do with the identity of the city. But what is the identity of the city? I think that it's easy to talk of genius loci or spirit of the place, spirit of the city. These expressions can be very impressive, but don't explain something which has to be understood by planners and architects. That is that each city has what we may call its genetic codes. That means some rules, some intrinsic laws, a specific culture which has regulated and which dictates the way the city changes, the way the city evolves, the way the city is able to accept or to refuse innovation. Of course, I'm speaking of cities which have a very long life, of cities that sometimes can have thousands of years of life, or anyway, many centuries. The case of cities which have been entirely designed since the beginning is totally different. Well, not totally. You have to understand the reason of their initial project. But in the case of cities like Venice, that grew through and developed through hundreds, thousands of years, you have to understand, you have to recognize the way the city has changed, the way the city has shaped its own space, its own architecture, and you will find that there are some rules which can be defined as genetic codes because they belong to the intrinsic culture of the city. So, to go back to the Bridge of Rialto, these wonderful paintings by Carpaccio explain very well what a bridge is in Venice. A bridge in Venice is a part of a system, of a double system, which regulates the urban fabric. The water system and the pedestrian system. You can see that water in Venice used to be lived and occupied by people, exactly like the ground, like the land. Now things have changed for different reasons, but this is a very nature of Venice. It's a city which is made of water and land, and canals are not a barrier. Canals are simply a way. And the bridges have to provide the possibility to boats to pass, to different boats, different types of boats to pass through, as well as to the people to continue their walk without interruptions. That's why in Venice most of the bridges, the ancient bridges, were arched, because the arch is the shape that provides this double continuity in the water and walking. And so that's the reason why the bridge of Palladio didn't like very much to the Venetians. I may say that Palladio was one of the competitors to a kind of competition which lasted about 20 years for the reconstruction of the Bridge of Venice. And his project was compared to other projects of very distinguished architects like Sansovino, Scamozzi, and so on, which were defeated as well, because they didn't understand this real, true nature of the city. In the end, the Bridge of Rialto was built by an unknown architect. Well, now it's very well known, but at the time was not very well known. It was a good engineer, a very good builder, and a very good businessman also, because as you can see, the number of shops that he managed to accommodate on the bridge is largely higher than the number of shops of Palladio. This is also another reason why the bridge should have been arched, because the path, the pedestrian path would have been longer than a straight one. I could continue on that, but there are many reasons, you know, that explains why a good architecture, Palladio is a good architect without no doubt, can find difficult to produce acceptable changes in the city, to be accepted by the city. And to me, the problem of new architecture or new design in historic settings is not a matter of style, is not even a matter of beauty, it's a matter of right or wrong. Is that necessary or not? What's the reason to have a new building? What's the reason to have a new construction? The motivation of the projects are more important than its quality. I want to be provocative, and I can add that you can have a very beautiful city made out of modest buildings. If you look Venice, which is a very beautiful city, not only because it's the city of mine and Mr. Zekin, but it's a beautiful city, everybody knows that. Along the Grand Canal, you can find about 50–60% of very ordinary buildings. But the Grand Canal is one of the most beautiful spaces in the world. Why? Again, because there are reasons which make the Grand Canal formally very, very rich. The fact that the city has always changed through reuse, reusing the old foundations, reusing the materials of the pre-existing buildings. Building in Venice is extremely expensive. Materials are extremely expensive, and so you have to reuse what exists. And so the city has always continuously rebuilt on its own. The space is reduced. Therefore, there were taxes, very hard taxes, you know, to define, which were linked to the width of the building on the canal. So you can see that all the fabric along the Grand Canal is defined by a kind of module which reflects the levels of taxes. A big house like the Cadoro is a double model, you see. A more modest house is a single model. And moreover, you can see that you can find everything, all kinds of styles, even in the same buildings. Look at these early Byzantine buildings, which was elevated in the late 13th century, and again with a Serlian window in the 16th century, and unfortunately, perhaps in the beginning of the past century with a very stupid elevation. But also look at, again, at the Cadoro and very nice, which is a Gothic building, and beside a 18th century building. And so on. Look at this part of the Grand Canal. You can find Renaissance, different types of Gothic, absolutely anonymous buildings of the 19th century, and so the Baroque Church of the Salute, and so on. So this is another genetic code of the city, that the rules, you know, that dictated the way the city has changed has allowed for a multiplicity of form, multiplicity of languages, multiplicity of styles, and everything was acceptable. But everything has to respect these codes. So we come very, very fast to our subject of the moment. And even in Venice, there were attempts to innovate radically the image of the city. So it was thought. Because in reality, the project of Frank Lloyd Wright, and even more the project of Le Corbusier, was totally consistent with the fabric of the city. But, you know, in the 50s, the idea was very strong that conservation should consist in the preservation of a so-called supposed traditional image of the city, and that it was a matter of style. So, in the case of Venice, or in the case of Verona, which was mentioned before. In the case of any cities which has a very long history, what is the traditional image of that city? Nobody could tell you. Is Venice a Gothic city or a Renaissance city, or is a stupid question. It's a city which has developed through 1,000 years and which has accepted all the possible languages. The problem is different. The problem is to know whether this building is right or wrong, has good motivations or not. Unfortunately, in the case of the beautiful project of Frank Lloyd Wright, it didn't have any motivation. I don't want to explain the story of that nice project, but in reality, the same program was implemented 20 years later through reuse of an existing building. So the hospital of Le Corbusier was a totally different story. In '65, there was the need, probably, of a new hospital in Venice, but a few years later, everybody understood that the city population was decreasing dramatically, and that there was no longer a need of a new hospital in Venice. And so this is the reason why that project was abandoned. But when these two projects were defeated, you know, in the name of the conservation of the traditional image of the city continues to change, and very, very likely. And different attempts have been made to reinterpret the urban fabric through new architectural forms, new architectural typologies, which respond to the context and which enrich the formal, how could I say, vocabulary of the city. These different experiences, which were carried out mainly by professors of the School of Architecture in Venice, that in that period was one of the most advanced in Italy, were very important in the Italian scene, particularly this building, which was defined as the new Cadoro of the 20th century by Giulio Carlo Argan, one of the most important art historians and architectural historians in Italy, and probably one of the most distinguished in Europe. These different attempts, these different buildings show different approaches, but more or less, they all respect the urban fabric, they all respect the alignments, the building heights. In this case, the effort is made to reinterpret the sense of the decoration of the facade in the Venetian architecture. In the other case, the attempt has been made to reinterpret the rhythm of the composition of the facade. In any case, there is an attempt to reinterpret the city through new forms. Probably the most interesting experiences are those of Carlo Scarpa, which was an excellent interior architect, we may say, but mainly was an extraordinary artisan, and which developed an idea of, we may say today, creative restoration, which is a contradiction in terms, but which is true, reinterpreted, you know, the buildings in a very creative way, but reusing and redeveloping, reviving the ancient know-how, the ancient artisan know-how. He reinterpreted the idea of reuse of materials, which is very consistent with the architecture in Venice and also with the architecture in many cities of Italy. So he reinvented or reintroduced some elements which have now become part of the tradition of the restoration, not only in Venice, but in many cities in Italy, the so-called marmorino, the finish which looks like marble, but which is made out with lime and other system, or the use of different type of stones, and the reinterpretation of the building as a part of a fabric, which again is made out of water and land. You can see this, this is the entrance of a cultural foundation he restored and he redesigned in the 60s. And this is the entrance at the ground floor. The ground floor is continuously flooded by the high water. And so he developed a design of this ground floor with the path elevated upon the level of the high water, but also allowing the high waters to enter the building and to be a part of it. So more recently, other attempts have been made in such a delicate urban fabric to reinterpret the urban morphology and the housing typologies. These new developments were made possible, if not necessary, by the fact that Venice was dead as an industrial city. Probably very few of you knows that until the mid of the 20th century, Venice was a very important industrial city, historic Venice in itself. These factories were abandoned in the 70s, in the 80s, and the population was decreasing. So in the attempt to keep the population in Venice, useless attempt, the municipality decided to redevelop many of this area, creating new housing. And again here, the attempt has been made to, with different approaches, with different formal attitudes, to reinterpret the urban morphology of the city and reinterpret their traditional housing typologies. Also, in the islands of the lagoon, some projects, one or two projects in particular, has been made of new urbanization, producing social housing as an extension of the existing vernacular or popular settlements. And also in this case, the attempt has been made to reinterpret the traditional fabric using, if you want, ambiguous forms, which wants to be a compromise within the old and the new, and mainly the reinterpretation of the typological and constructive logic and strategy of the city. So, this long introduction on Venice, in reality, gives me the possibility to fix some more general possible principles which define what is, to me, today, the challenge of the new design in historic cities. I would like to mention very, very briefly, and eventually in the discussion I could go back to that. The first point is that preservation and reuse of the existing buildings and the existing space must be the first option. Also because historic architecture has in general a very high capacity to be converted to new uses and activities. I'm talking in general, not everywhere, but in general it is like that. And also we don't have to forget that heritage values are today, in many countries, in many cities, a very important economic asset. The preservation and enhancement of the historic fabric makes, in many cases, the investment in restoration and reuse very attractive, even more attractive than new buildings. In Italy, in many cities of France, it is like that. The real estate values in the historic cities are more than the double than the real estate values than in the new extensions. And in our countries, about 60–70% of the building activity is conversion, restoration, and so on. Like it or not, when the principle is defined that to preserve is the first option, and when rules and laws goes in favor of this, the result in few years is that restoration, preservation become more profitable than new buildings. Second, new buildings, constructions and whatever, should be envisaged within the historic fabric only when compatible and when necessary. In order to do what? In order when it's needed to develop new urban functions that cannot be accommodated into old buildings, or create new relationship, infrastructure, and so on, which would add to the vitality of the historic city. Third point is that in any case, the interpretation doesn't mean imitation of the specific urban context. It means respect the genetic codes. It is an expression of Giancarlo De Carlo, which I mentioned before. And in this framework, I would say, different approaches are possible, which should be based, in any case, on the reading and understanding of the urban fabric. I think that new forms and architectural languages need, in any case, to be familiar, to be friendly with the context, not overwhelming and imposing. And I do think that the so-called iconic intervention can be acceptable sometimes, but they are rarely needed. Mainly they are not needed when they simply express the personality of the architect. Architectural stars are bound to pass, and architecture, unfortunately, remain. So when the disaster is done, even if it is a disaster with a good, how do you say, brand, you know, it is a disaster, and that's all. So, very careful about that. Few examples of what I intend as a contextual approach or iconic approach. Sometimes these approaches are mixed. This is a case of a new cultural center in Brussels, designed by Andrea Bruno. Not to harm anyone, I only choose an Italian and Spanish architects. I don't know who is the designer of these buildings, but it reflects the same approach in Frankfurt, you know. You see clearly that to a certain extent you can say that it is an imitation of the old buildings, but in reality formally is a totally different choice. I mean, formally there is no imitation, there is the need, the attempt to reinterpret more the structure of the building, its logic, and its, I could have said, its typology, indeed. Another case is the reconstruction of the theater Liceu, which was burnt about 10 years ago or so, and which was rebuilt by Ignasi Sola Morales in Barcelona, together with all the rest of the manzana, of the block. And so the building of the theater was kept, was reconstructed indeed, and the rest of the manzana was redesigned according to the same alignments, to the same building heights of the rest of the manzana, but with a totally different organization of the spaces inside, also because the program was extremely ambitious. Iconic approach, the examples could be many, but in reality not so many. If you look at the Italian or the Spanish, let's say the Mediterranean scene, very likely it's very rare to see things like that. I mean, new huge buildings which destroy the existing urban pattern, which are imposed to the historic fabric. And however, the effects and the results are very clear. Another mixed approach is this market by Eric Miralles, which you probably know. Eric Miralles rebuilt an ancient market, and this intervention of reuse has become, in reality, a new icon. I don't know if it is positive or not for Barcelona. I have my idea, but the approach was this one. Or this library by Rafael Moneo in Leuven, which reuses an ancient convent and add a new building to it. always keeping very clear, you know, the relationship between the old and the new. The old is restored according to the rules of the Charter of Venice, more or less, and the new is totally free of any linguistic or stylistic constraints. So, again, I should stop. Of course, as I forecast, I don't manage to finish my presentation, but let me show a few points that I also consider necessary. New design has to be linked to planning. I am a planner, so let me make a plea for my own work, has to be linked to planning. You cannot think to intervene in a historic city by spot, you know, and deciding case by case. You have to have a general framework, you have to have general criteria, and you have to leave architects free to express themselves within this framework. Otherwise, I think that every decision is simply arbitrarian, and that every transformation of the city has not the possibility to be monitored, to be judged, to be evaluated afterwards. Thank you very much. I just stop here.
Well, I think it was very appropriate that our last speaker, given that we're in the College of Physicians, should have referred to a genetic code. I think it's a very fine approach to the physical presence of buildings, I think, in our city. I think the other main points I took from your presentation were, of course, that we're not concerned with style or beauty, we're concerned with right or wrong. Such an elementary distinction to know when you're right or when you're wrong. However, I was very glad that you showed something of the work of Carlo Scarpa, because I'm in the Castel Vecchio in Verona. Carlo Scarpa's intervention is reasonable because Napoleon had made a mess of the barracks before, so he was putting something back into the building. But a city like Verona, I come back to Verona, a city of great charm that was very badly damaged during the last war, and when one goes and sees a remarkable library by Nervi in one of the side streets, alongside the wonderful church of San Zeno, and straight away I think we come to your point that everything is possible provided it's sensible and in harmony. Now we have the last part of our meeting is to open up for discussion, and I would remind you again that we have this subsidiary group sitting in the seminar room that hasn't had the opportunity of the chemistry of the interface with the speakers, but no doubt we'll have some questions. And I would like our speakers now, if we would come and sit at the table, and I would ask you, each of you, to be very concise in your questions, and for the sake of the fact we've got about 450 people to compress into 25 minutes, I would not want you to make statements. I'd like you to ask simple questions and direct them to perhaps each of the speakers. Thank you. And when you pose your question, for the benefit of the note takers, I'd be grateful if you could just give your name. Thank you. Who's first? There's a lady up here. The microphone. We'll just give you the microphone, please. Thank you.
Well, I'm not a lady, but never mind.
I'm sorry, excuse me. You look so charming.
I promise I'll get a haircut. So my name is Robert Adam, and I'm an architect. My question is primarily to Professor Pini, who quite correctly said that building historic context is not a matter of style, which I agree completely. However, Cesare did actually mention the Vienna Memorandum, which does in fact contain a ban on a particular style. It actually says there should be no pseudo-historical architecture in historic settings. The words are pseudo-historical, which is in effect a ban on a style. I think I'd like to comment on this because I think pseudo-historical is a logical impossibility. And for those who aren't architects, this actually means a ban on traditional architecture. And I would put it to the speakers that actually tradition, that thing being the continuity from the past, allowing change, but having clearly reflecting the past it came from, is precisely the identity and precisely the genetic code of a place, tradition properly interpreted. So I would say that, yes, it's not a matter of style, and the Vienna Memorandum should not be banning a particular style. I would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Well, indeed, the Vienna Memorandum doesn't talk about styles, if I'm not wrong. The Vienna Memorandum is very important because, differently from the Charter of Venice of '64, it stressed the need of contemporary architecture in historic settings. And the Vienna Memorandum expands considerably the notion of heritage. It's not talking only of monuments or outstanding sites or sites of outstanding significance, but the Vienna Memorandum talks of environments and relationship between the site and the society who lives in the environment. And they stress the importance of contemporary architecture. I stop here just to say that it's a totally different approach from this point of view compared to the Charter of Venice, which has become the basic manifesto, if I could say, of the conservationist, in Europe in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and so on, and which clearly defines what is conservation and what is restoration. The Vienna Memorandum adds to the idea of conservation and restoration this idea that the preservation of historic urban landscape, this is the definition, it's a matter of a very complex strategy, and it involves different tools and different methods, not only the conservation and restoration, but also contemporary architecture. That's, to me, the meaning of the Vienna Memorandum.
I think the critical point is that the memorandum refers to contemporary architecture, not modern architecture.
Another question? Yeah, one moment, please, but get the microphone. Yes, it's just coming behind you.
Thanks.
So give your name, please.
Giorgio Granozio, Edinburgh architect. Professor Dini, what do you think about the complete, if I can call fake, in Venice about the La Fenice reconstruction? That is a perfect fake, but is not anymore the original. So that is quite tricky to reconstruct something that it was like it was a long time ago, but is still a fake. What do you think about this?
Well, as you said, I think it's a fake. It's an inevitable fake because, first of all, the Fenice, which has burnt, was already been completely rebuilt in '37. So it's an 18th century building which was rebuilt at least 3 or 4 times completely. I understand the popular need, I would say need, to rebuild the Fenice as it was and where it was. But it's also clear that nobody could really believe that this was possible. And the Fenice, which has been rebuilt now, it's a totally new theater within an old envelope which has been restored. And it has been a very important exercise of craftsmanship, that's for sure, in order to reconstruct and all the furniture and so on. It's a very complex and very ambiguous operation, but the city is also made of ambiguity. We have to be clear, and especially our cities in Italy, we have such a strong relationship to history. We are subject to any kind of ambiguity. So.
Is there a question from the seminar room, perhaps, that someone would like to make? Can I hear you? Can you hear me? In the absence of a noise, I assume they're still there.
We have no questions from here, thank you.
Was that a voice from outer space? Yes. This time, excuse me. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Raffaello Cone. I'm an engineer, and this is a question for Mr. Benarski. Sorry, it's just, I hope I have the pronunciation okay. I think that bridges are the most beautiful thing that can be built, actually, because I think that you have to, well, you know that there are rules that we have to respect, otherwise they don't stand up, and this is why they come up beautifully, because we follow nature. Anyway, and I like very much the distinction that you made between compression and tension. How do you feel about new materials, which also made possible some new things nowadays that probably the Romans didn't know? And how do they integrate with the old heritage, with the heritage settings?
I think our duty is to create the future heritage. You know, I mean, you cannot stop creating heritage. You know, some of our works now would be the future heritage. And heritage always was at the cutting edge of either thought or technology or some other means. So we are simply, you know, we simply have to do it and have to use what our times give to us. I mean, the little bridge I showed, which looks like Calatravas, it was in fact to be the first in the world carbon fiber bridge protected with a film of diamonds, which was killed by local opposition, and they called it the Yappy tennis racket from hell, which I hope to have on my gravestone. But it was, in fact, we were using the carbon fiber because it was the most rigid material available, and as a result, the structural depth of the arch was the smallest possible. And it was inspired by the Mons of Chagall's paintings. So it was, you know, entirely landscape bridge as such, but, you know, the locals thought that was something which was outer space, and they killed it.
Yes, so there's a gentleman just there. Thank you.
Malcolm Fraser, Edinburgh architect. First I'd say that those of us who observe that tradition is progressive are very grateful to Robert Adam for bringing up this part of the Vienna Charter. It's very interesting to read that. My question is for Professor Pini, and your last comment about planners setting frameworks for cities, I think is extremely relevant, and it's a surprise to me sometimes that architects take all the blame for the way cities are. I think planners and architects are equally complicit, and it's always a surprise to me when somehow the answer to that particular failure is to take power of architects and give it to planners. I think we have to understand the extremely relevant question is what is the balance between what planners do well and what architects do well. And to me, there is too much use of power to tell architects what to do, and not enough creative challenging of architects to actually show and demonstrate how they can innovate, understand the context, understand what the DNA is, and what the current iteration of that DNA actually does, what a living tradition is, not what a reactionary backward tradition might be, what a modern tradition might be. And I think it's a primary question for how we look at traditional cities, is to understand how, instead of using and abusing power, or when architects get a bit of power to show off too much, architects need to learn how to be calmer, more responsible, and sometimes more boring, and sometimes more ugly in certain ways. And planners need to learn not to tell them what to do, but to goad them and challenge them to a far greater extent. I'd like to hear your reaction to that and how you think that might be achieved.
No, I think, if I understand what you mean, that, I think you're right. It's a very delicate issue, in my opinion, the issue of relationship between planning and, in general, planning and architecture. I think that, unfortunately, there is a split between these two activities, which should be strongly linked. I always think that a planner should be trained as an architect, and an architect should be also aware, you know, of an architect of planning issues. I think that is very dangerous. It has been a big mistake, to separate these two types of training, in our schools, in our universities. In Italy, this happened in the last 20 years. I don't know in England, but I think this is extremely dangerous, especially when compared to some specific planning task. I think that conservation planning is a very special type of planning because it requires a very accurate identification and understanding of the architectural features which make, the fabric, the urban setting in general. And this requires a very deep knowledge of architecture, an understanding of architecture. And on the other hand, I think that when the profession, the architectural profession is confronted, must address, the issues of, I'm not talking of restoration. Restoration, it's a very, how could I say, specific issue, but restoration only concerns, let's say, 2, 3, 5% of a building in an historic center. The monuments, the buildings which are documented, restoration is more a scientific activity rather than a technical or an artistic one, let's say. But all the rest, the renovation, rehabilitation, all different types of intervention that you usually do in historic cities need a deep understanding also of the motivation of the interventions and of the planning motivation, of the planning rules. That is something that has to be built in day by day by association, by the school, which requires the development of a specific culture, and it's a very complicated and difficult task.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. Can I just bring a British angle onto it? I've been working in the UK for 27 years, and I suffered planners and conservation officers and design officers for all this time. My perception is that urban design is an abstract art. Now, in Britain, we have one of the fears I've detected over 27 years, that we have the fear of the abstract. And what is happening that planners, by some definition urban designers, are infringing on areas which are to do with the figurative art. And I think they should stick to the abstract art, which is urban planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I try and bring these people from the seminar room into the discussion? It's a bit like a seance. I think we should hold hands and try and reach out to them. Can you hear me? Modern systems never do work, do they?
Yes, good evening. This is Frances Gallagher, Leadership Consultant, FRSA. I've been fascinated by what I've heard tonight, but I'm a very grounded person. And although you're talking about always creating the modern heritage and therefore using new materials, new structures, new engineering philosophies, how do you reconcile that with the need, I feel anyway, to retain former practical skills which exist at the moment as well, like those of a stonemason, carpenters, etc. How do our speakers reconcile that with modern architectural experiences?
Cesare, would you like to try that one first?
Yeah, it's a very painful subject, I would say, because there is certainly de-skilling on construction sites throughout the world, and the levels of skills are falling. However, that's the way it is. I mean, we are advancing our technologies, advancing our lives, advancing the way we do things, and certain skills which were, necessary in the past became useful currently, and they might not be of any use to anybody in the future.
I'm conscious of and I'd like to give the floor to 2 more questions, please. One just here, the microphone, please, and then you.
My name is David Black. I have professional interest in historic buildings, but I'm not an architect. I would like to ask about the icon and whether it's a curse or a blessing. I'm intrigued by a book by a gentleman called Dr. John Silber. He is President Emeritus of Boston University, and he has really written something akin to a manifesto attacking the iconic building in the United States and naming names and taking specific schemes, like obviously the John Hancock building in Boston and many others. And he is actually an architect by training originally, before he became an academic. His view is that the iconic building has just gone too far in the 20th century and now in the 21st. I don't know if there's an official ICOMOS view on this, but if both speakers could, if they've read the book, if they could react to it, and would they have a view on that subject? Thanks very much.
Professor Feeney, would you respond briefly on that one?
Yeah. What to say? I'm not saying that, oh, sorry. What's the need? My question is, what's the need of iconic buildings today in historic settings? That's the point. You can do iconic buildings elsewhere where you need it, but I don't think that historic settings, our historic cities, need more iconic buildings. That's the point. If they need, well, we can discuss it. But what are the new functions? What are the new significations? What are the new meanings that you want to add in a perspective of preservation, you know, to our historic cities today? The point is that historic city today is only a small part of the larger city. It's not the city on its own. So perhaps if you need new functions, perhaps if you need new expressions of culture, of power, or whatever you want, you can, it's better to build them elsewhere, not particularly in the historic city. I don't have anything against iconic architecture. My question is it right or wrong? That's the point. Thank you.
I entirely agree with this point of view. Prospect magazine in 2005 had an interesting article which was exchange of letters between Diane Sujic and Charles Jenks, in which the term Costa del Icon was applied to London. Well, I think the bottom line is such that iconic buildings have happened throughout this human civilization. You know, when you get to power, when you get to the need of expressing yourselves in means other than verbal, you build an icon, like a pyramid or Taj Mahal or some other thing like this, you know. So this is nothing new in human nature, and it will carry on. There's simply no doubt about this. Now, where it should go is a separate discussion altogether. Thank you.
My name is Christine Richard. I'm neither an architect nor a town planner, but I am a politician. You started to touch on the humanity of architecture and restoration just at the end there. I'd like to briefly ask both of you, how do you see heritage restoration in terms of the needs of people, and is there any role in historic cities for restoring the heart of these cities populated by the whole strata of the population living, working and having recreation?
No, I think that more than restoration, in these cases, rehabilitation is needed, which is something different from restoration. But probably we don't have time to discuss this subject now. But I mean, I think that you have to preserve, you have to, of course, to take care of those parts of the society, the weakest part of the society, which still lives in the historic cities. The point is that restoration is nothing but a part of the conservation issue. It's not the whole. So we must be clear about that.
I think human content is critical to anything we do. There's simply no discussion on this subject. And you know, renewal is probably the more appropriate term. And restoration is part of renewal as such. But you know, it's a very, very difficult subject, multifaceted.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure that was a good question to end with, the question of humanity, suitability for purpose, the right or the wrong, as it was expressed so cogently. These are decisions which require what I said right at the beginning is common sense. Now, common sense is often not in good supply when it comes to certain political decisions which are weighed one way or the other to suit a manifesto. I only wish that one could have a clarity of thought for politicians to set down parameters which enable people to be creative and not constrained. I would like to thank both the speakers, but really the task of the vote of thanks is really not for me, but for Roderick Miller. Thank you.
It's 10 years since the first Angus Millar Lecture was delivered, and throughout that period, the RSA has maintained an extraordinary calibre of speaker. This evening is absolutely no exception. On behalf of the RSA and on the Millar family, I'd like to thank Professor Pini and Cesare Bednarski for their extremely stimulating and sometimes challenging presentation, and throwing a spotlight on concepts that clearly have a great relevance to us in Scotland, and perhaps, if I'm allowed to mention it now, particularly here in Edinburgh at the moment, demanding we all be much more searching in particular in thinking about new design in heritage settings. I'm only sorry that time prevented the question session from continuing the discussion further, but many thanks to you both indeed. I'd also like to recognise and thank a number of organisations and individuals without whom this evening would not have occurred. Foremost is Anne Packard, whose relentless energy and administration has made tonight such a success. She's been ably helped by Dale Idians and Jill Mackenzie, and support's also been given by Anderson Strathern solicitors, the Italian Institute, Historic Scotland, Z-Print, and the staff here at the Royal College of Physicians. Many thanks to them all.
And so with that vote of thanks from Roderick Millar, the meeting is now closed. Thank you very much.